In this quick start tutorial, we'll look at how we add effects to clips and how we build effect stacks within the timeline. Again, this is just a quick start, so have a look for the more detailed tutorials later on compositing and color correcting and so on. So new users to Mystica will immediately see the size, the height of the timeline and the many tracks that appear. And the reason for this is that we can build effect stacks within the timeline. So whereas other compositing systems would use a sort of nodal interface, Mystica actually combines that within the context of the timeline. In effect, images flow upwards, so again grabbing the cursor with our left mouse button or tapping down with the pen, we can see on the display down here, or more likely the external video monitor, that the cursor is seeing the contents of this clip, and as soon as it leaves the clip we can no longer see it. Likewise, if I were to bring this clip above our original clip, as we go across the join we see a cut between the two because we're looking down onto this stack, so we see this one before this one. So the way we build effects within Mystica, or add simple effects to Mystica, or add simple effects to a Mystica timeline, is on the process that images flow upwards. For example, let's just add a simple effect to this long clip here. So I'm just going to choose the Effects tab and just randomly crystallize. And we can see that we've got an effect running on our clip. And again, if we take our monitor cursor, drag it all the way down, below the clip we see nothing. As we go up to the clip we see it neat. And as we go up to the effect, we see the clip running through the effect. Let's just look at adding that effect in more detail. So I'll delete it. With our little cursor here, and nothing else selected, if I pick something from the effects menu, the effect will appear as a default length and floating on its own, and as we can see when we move the cursor over it, nothing's happening. An important aspect of an effect is its scope, and that's this little line that descends out of the bottom of an effect, which you can see if you grab an effect and move it up, or click near the bottom of the effect and drag down. Effectively what this is it's saying what this effect is going to be connected to. So for example, you can see at the moment it's not connected to any clip, there's no clip residing within its space here. But if I drag this down, you can see the moment it makes contact with an effect, the effect comes to life, because we're effectively saying that we want this clip connected to that effect. And you can see it's completely valid, if a little untidy, to have spaces. That's fine, because the effect will always look downwards to find the clips that it needs to be driven by, and that might be one clip or multiple clips depending on the type of effect. Now that was just adding an effect randomly with nothing selected, and again you can see that the clip just appears at a default length and in that location. Actually, in practicality, the easier way of doing it is to select a clip first and then add the effect, because then the effect will automatically be the right length for the clip that you've chosen, and it'll attach itself with the scope. So it's the easiest way of avoiding errors. You can also do multiple selections. Some clips have multiple inputs, in which case we simply stack the inputs together. So for example, I'll take these two different shots and I'm just going to align them to the left and over the two, selecting both, edit, wipe, maybe that one. And now we can see that our effect is doing a wipe between this shot, and then the result. And as we can see, the wipe effect has a scope where it's looking for two inputs, obviously something it's wiping from and wiping to. And again, these can be placed wherever. Controlling the parameters of an effect varies depending on which effect you're using. Some have their own specific interfaces, but all can be controlled by the parameters curves. So let's do a simple blur. So again, with this clip selected, FX, blur. And then what I'll do is I'll double click on the blur. If you're on a single screen GUI, your timeline's now disappeared and the compose window has appeared. And if you're on a dual GUI, then the compose window is on the right hand side. In the lower left hand part of the pane are the parameters for the effect that I've selected. So in this case it's a blur, and by changing the radius we can see we're changing the size of the blur. By clicking curves we can see our parameter on a graph, which is scalable here. And by selecting auto key we can make the keyframes place automatically if we wanted to make some animation. We'll have a full tutorial separately on the workings of this parameters panel. Some effects have their own dedicated control panels. For example, if I were to choose the color corrector, add a color correction here and double click, you can now see that rather than curves I've got a more reasonable looking color correction interface. The important thing to know is actually everything within Mistika starts with the graph and the curves. So even if you were color correcting like this, you can get at the mathematics of what's going on. So as you can see here, if I start changing the white points, you can see the values are changing. And likewise, by clicking curves here, I can hide the color correction interface and actually look at what's happening on a graph. Clicking curves will get me back to the dedicated control panel. Multiple effects can also be ganged together and controlled. For example, I'll take this shot, I'll add a blur node, and then I'll add a color correction node. If I double click the top effect, the compose window will show me the result of both of those effects on the clip, which at the moment are in their default settings, so we're not seeing any difference. And within the compose window you'll see on either the left or the right hand side the eval tree, which can be switched on and off here, which is basically showing us the little map. So we can see that we're starting with our clip, which is called comp1, it's then being put through a Gaussian blur and then through an RGB color correction. And a key point of control here is the difference between clicking and double clicking. Where I click allows me to access the parameters for a given effect that I've just clicked on. For example, you can see here that I'm clicking between the Gaussian blur, which then gives me the controls for the blur, and the color corrector. But you'll notice the shaded area here is actually where I double click. So single clicking an effect allows me to access its parameters, whereas double clicking an effect says where I want to view the effect stack from. So for example, let's put some parameters into these so we can see it changing. So in the blur node we'll add some blur, and in the color corrector we'll make a change. Now if I double click different levels we can inspect the different tiers of the effects and the different processes and what they're doing. So double clicking on the bottom clip, I see the neat clip. Double clicking on the blurred clip, I see just the blur, and double clicking on the color corrector shows me blurred and color corrected. Single clicking, remember, just gets me the parameters. So if I remain double clicked on the top level, which is blurred and color corrected, but single click on the blur, now it means that I can change the blur level while still viewing through the color correction. Again, we'll have a more detailed tutorial on how we work the whole compose window. Looking back at the timeline, we can see something similar if we drag the cursor. So from nothing to the first clip, which is neat, then go up one, we see it blurred, and go up one and we see it color corrected. And this is the fundamental process of working Mistika, is building combinations of effects to get the look or effect that you really want. Effect stacks can be saved and copied and edited just like any other clip. So for example, if I wanted to copy these effects, Control C onto this clip here, Control V, I can now align them here. And if I wanted to change the length to match, again, just like editing a normal clip. Alternatively, effects don't have to be the same length as the clips they apply to. This is perfectly valid, and as you can see, my lovely golden blurry effect is now over an edit. Just like the eval tree in the compose window, there's also a tool in the timeline that helps with the flows of effects as well. So under edit, setup, I can switch on flow monitor, and here you can see gives us a little map of how our images are being processed. So we take the input into the blur, into the color correct, and then outwards. The benefit of having effect stacks in the timeline is that you can show transitions. For example, if I wanted to transition out from that effect, I've made a duplicate of the original clip, and I'm now going to go edit, mix, up. And just for this tutorial, put on my record monitor down here so I can see it. Obviously it's normally on the external video, but here you can now see that my effect is mixing off. You can also see that the flow monitor is updating as we start to enter new effects. And the reason this is working the way it is if I find my way halfway through the transition, I've taken a shot, I've blurred it, I've added a color correction. That's all done. Now separately, I've taken the shot again, but this mix unit here is doing a half mix in this case between this result and this, because it has its two inputs in the scope in here. So that was a very quick tutorial on how effects are built within Mistika. Obviously look for the more detailed tutorials later on, but hopefully that's enough to get you started. A useful resource here is the Mistika manual. If you have a look for the effects section and just open up Mistika effects, every single effect in the Mistika system is detailed here. So for example, let's look at that blur that we were just playing with. We can see that the manual gives us a brief overview of the effect, then tells us how many inputs it's expecting, how many outputs it'll give us, and it goes on to detail every single parameter and what each parameter does, and also the ranges of the parameters. So for example, the radius here, we can see it has a default of 0 and a range from 0 to 100. And finally, each section goes on to show an example of what the effect might be used for. So this is a very useful section of the manual.